What I discovered about Bigfoot origins contradicts every cryptozoology theory, every native legend, every scientific assumption we've made about these creatures. And the proof didn't come from decades of research or advanced technology. It came from an orphaned child I found dying in the wilderness, who showed me things that still keep me awake at night. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried, and after 14 years of silence, I believe it's time someone knew the truth. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 62 years old, and I was a wildlife biologist specializing in apex predator behavior for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is my account of what happened in the North Cascades during the autumn of 2008. And I need to tell it exactly as it occurred, because what I learned changes everything we think we understand about what's hiding in our forests. September of 2008 painted the North Cascades in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. I was 30 years old back then, fresh off completing my PhD in behavioral ecology from the University of Washington, and eager to prove myself in my first major field research position. I'd spent the previous 13 years studying predator behavior, from my undergraduate work tracking cougars in Montana to my doctoral research on gray wolf pack dynamics in Yellowstone. The North Cascades posting was exactly what I'd worked toward, a chance to document the expanding wolf population in one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States. The crisp air carried the scent of pine resin and wet moss as I made my way through dense forest on September 23rd, following a wolf pack I'd been monitoring for 6 weeks. My supervisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, had assigned me to document their hunting patterns and territorial behavior. Standard protocol involved radio telemetry tracking, SCAD analysis, and documenting kill sites. Nothing about that morning suggested I was about to encounter something that would derail my entire career and rewrite my understanding of biology itself. I'd been tracking the Mountain Creek Pack, a group of 7 wolves that had established territory in a particularly rugged section of the park, about 12 miles from the nearest trail. What caught my attention that morning was an unusual pattern in their behavior. Over the previous 3 days, I'd found 4 deer carcasses that showed clear wolf kill signatures, puncture wounds to the throat, hemorrhaging consistent with pack takedown tactics. But the prey had barely been consumed. Maybe 10% of the available meat had been eaten before the pack abandoned the kills. In 15 years of studying predators, I'd never seen anything like it. Wolves don't waste food. They can't afford to. A successful hunt requires enormous energy expenditure, and apex predators are hardwired to maximize caloric return. Finding multiple abandoned kills suggested something was wrong. Disease, perhaps, or interference from a larger predator. I documented each site carefully, taking photographs, collecting tissue samples, measuring bite patterns. My field notes from that week filled 37 pages. It was late afternoon, around 4:15 p.m., when I found the source of the wolves' disrupted behavior. I'd been following a game trail along a steep ravine, using my GPS to mark coordinates, when I heard something that made me stop dead. Not a vocalization exactly, more like labored breathing, wet and ragged, punctuated by soft sounds that my brain wanted to categorize as whimpering. The same sound an injured dog might make. I approached cautiously, one hand on the bear spray attached to my belt. The breathing came from a dense thicket of devil's club and salmonberry bushes about 40 yards off the trail. I could see disturbed earth, broken branches, signs of struggle. My first thought was an injured wolf, maybe caught in one of the illegal snares that poachers sometimes set despite federal protections. What I found wasn't a wolf. Tangled in an old bear snare, the kind with rusty steel cables that hadn't been legal in Washington for 20 years, was something I'd never seen before. At first glance in the dappled shadows, my brain tried to rationalize it as a young bear. But as I moved closer, that rationalization crumbled completely. The creature was roughly 4.5 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair that was matted with dirt and dried blood. It had a distinctly humanoid body structure: broad shoulders, long arms, hands with 5 fingers and opposable thumbs. The face was both human and profoundly not human. A flat nose, heavy brow ridge, dark eyes that tracked my movement with obvious intelligence and terror. The snare had caught its left leg just above the ankle, the cable cutting deep into flesh beneath the fur. The limb was badly swollen, and I could see signs of infection starting to set in. The creature made a sound when it saw me, a low vocalization that carried notes of fear and resignation. It tried to pull back, but it was too weak. I could see the trembling in its muscles, the way its chest heaved with each breath. It had been there for days, maybe longer. Severe dehydration had sunken its eyes, and its lips were cracked and bleeding. I stood frozen, my field training warring with the impossibility of what I was seeing. Every protocol I'd ever learned suddenly seemed inadequate. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't supposed to exist. But there it was, suffering, dying, and watching me with eyes that held something I recognized. Not just fear, understanding. The knowledge of what I represented, what my species had always represented to creatures we didn't understand. I made a decision that would change everything. I slowly lowered myself to a crouch, making myself less threatening. My hands shook as I pulled out my water bottle and extended it forward, keeping my movements deliberate and non-aggressive. The creature watched, its dark eyes moving from the bottle to my face and back again. Then, with painful slowness, it reached out one trembling hand and took the bottle. It drank desperately, water spilling down its chin and matting the fur on its chest. I spent the next 20 minutes working the snare loose with bolt cutters from my emergency pack, talking softly the entire time, explaining what I was doing even though I had no idea if it could understand. When the cable finally released, the creature pulled its injured leg close, cradling it with both hands. I offered more water and a protein bar from my pack. It took both, eating with a delicacy that seemed almost human. I stayed until darkness began falling. Maybe 3 hours total, just sitting there at a respectful distance while the creature rested. I took photographs with my digital camera, measurements with my tape measure, documented everything with the clinical precision my training demanded. Height, approximately 135 centimeters. Weight, estimated 45 kilograms based on frame structure. Bipedal locomotion, oppositely thumbed hands, forward-facing eyes indicating predator ancestry. But none of my measurements could capture what I saw in those eyes. Intelligence, awareness, something that made my scientific detachment feel like a betrayal. When I finally left, promising to return with medical supplies and more food, the creature watched me go. I hiked back to my truck in the growing darkness, my mind racing with implications I wasn't ready to process. I didn't report what I'd found to Dr. Chen. I didn't call the Park Service. I told myself I needed to verify what I'd seen, to document it properly before making claims that would destroy my credibility. The truth was simpler. I couldn't let a child die alone in the woods. I returned at dawn the next morning, carrying antibiotics, bandages, electrolyte solutions, and 2 bags of groceries. The creature was still there, curled in a makeshift shelter it had constructed from branches and moss. It looked up when I approached, and this time there was no fear in its eyes. just exhaustion and something that looked almost like relief. That's when I noticed what it had been doing. All around its shelter, scratched into the bare earth and drawn on flat rocks with pieces of charcoal, were images, symbols, abstract patterns that showed clear intentionality and structure. I photographed them all, not understanding yet what they meant, not knowing that these crude drawings contained a truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about biology, about evolution, about our place in the universe. Those drawings would haunt me for the next 18 months. Because when I finally understood what they meant, I realized these creatures weren't what any of us thought at all. And the truth about where they came from was more terrifying than any campfire story ever invented. I began visiting twice a week, carefully timing my trips to coincide with legitimate wolf tracking activities. Dr. Chen never questioned why my field research required such frequent visits to the Mountain Creek territory, and I made sure my official reports contained enough genuine wolf behavior data to justify the pattern. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, I'd load my truck with supplies hidden beneath camping equipment and telemetry gear, driving the 40-minute route to the Forest Service Road that accessed the remote section where the creature waited. I started thinking of him as Reed, named after the narrow creek that ran through the area where I'd found him. I never said the name aloud, keeping it private, a small boundary between my scientific obligations and the relationship that was forming. Reed's recovery was gradual but remarkable. The infection in his leg responded to the antibiotics I'd brought, though I had to guess at dosages based on his estimated body weight and metabolic rate. By the third week of October, he was putting weight on the injured limb, and by early November, he was moving through the forest with a fluid grace that made me question whether he'd ever really been as hurt as he'd appeared. The food I brought varied each visit: fresh salmon from the Pike Place Market, bags of apples and pears, raw vegetables, unsalted nuts, occasionally venison or elk meat from a hunting friend who didn't ask questions about my sudden interest in large quantities of protein. Reed accepted everything with what seemed like genuine appreciation, examining each new item carefully before eating. He was methodical, almost ritualistic in how he consumed food, separating different types into small piles, eating in a specific order that I began to recognize as consistent across visits. But it was the drawings that consumed my attention. Every time I arrived, Reed had created new images. They covered flat rocks arranged around his shelter, scratched into the bark of nearby trees, traced in the dirt with sticks. At first, I dismissed them as simple mark-making, the kind of behavior documented in captive great apes given enrichment materials. But as weeks passed, the patterns became more complex, more deliberately structured. They weren't random, they followed rules. I photographed everything, filling 3 separate SD cards with documentation that I kept locked in a fireproof safe in my apartment, separate from any work materials. The symbols showed clear progression, building on previous forms, combining elements in new ways. Some resembled mathematical notations. Others looked almost like circuit diagrams or architectural blueprints rendered in primitive medium. One series of drawings showed concentric circles with radiating lines, proportions that seemed too precise to be accidental. Reed began demonstrating tool use that went far beyond anything I'd observed in primates. He'd modified a branch into a specialized fishing implement, stripping the bark in specific places to create grip points, sharpening one end to a precise angle for spearing salmon in the shallow creek. I watched him create a cutting tool by fracturing a piece of volcanic rock along natural plains, then using the sharp edge to process meat with startling efficiency. These weren't lucky accidents. They were engineered solutions. The communication started simply. Reed would vocalize, a range of sounds from low rumbles to higher-pitched clicking noises, and watch my reactions carefully. I began responding verbally, narrating my actions as I unpacked supplies or tended to his shelter. Within a month, Reed was mimicking specific English words. Not perfectly. His vocal anatomy wasn't quite human, but recognizably. Water, food, friend. The last one made my chest tighten every time he said it. By January 2009, we'd developed a rudimentary, shared language. Reed combined English words with his own vocalizations and gestures, creating a pidgin communication system that worked surprisingly well. He asked questions constantly. Where does the sun go at night? Why does water become hard when it's cold? His curiosity seemed boundless, and his ability to grasp concepts I explained was unsettling. I found myself teaching him basic physics, biology, astronomy, watching as he absorbed information and then incorporated it into new drawings. I searched extensively for Reed's family during those months, expanding my radius to 15 miles in every direction from where I'd found him. I documented Bigfoot sign that I'd previously dismissed or misidentified, large footprints in mud near creek beds, peculiar tree structures that showed clear manipulation, scratches on bark that followed patterns too regular to be natural. The evidence suggested others of Reed's kind lived in the area, or had recently. But I never saw another living Bigfoot, never heard vocalizations that weren't Reed's, never found any indication of where his family had gone. Reed showed signs of grief that were unmistakable. Sometimes I'd arrive to find him sitting motionless, staring toward the mountains with an expression I could only describe as longing. He'd make soft, mournful vocalizations that carried across the forest, calls that went unanswered. Through drawings, he showed me what I interpreted as his family, multiple figures of varying sizes. Then he'd gesture a sweeping motion, the universal sign for gone, vanished no more. I assumed they'd died. Disease, perhaps, or hunters. The North Cascades had seen increased human activity over the previous decade, more backpackers, more photographers seeking wilderness experiences. A family of Bigfoot trying to remain hidden would face mounting pressure. The thought of Reed as the sole survivor of his group created a weight in my chest that grew heavier with each visit. Winter deepened, and I began bringing construction materials alongside food. Using tarps, paracord, and fallen logs, I helped Reed winterize his shelter, creating something more substantial than his original moss and branch construction. I brought thermal blankets rated for sub-zero temperatures, a waterproof sleeping bag, even a small camping stove with fuel canisters, though I wasn't sure he'd understand how to use it safely. He figured it out within minutes, his hands moving over the mechanism with an understanding that seemed intuitive rather than learned. The bond between us shifted from researcher and subject to something I couldn't quite name. Reed would greet me with obvious excitement, sometimes touching my shoulder gently or sitting close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He'd show me things he'd found, interesting rocks or bird feathers, presenting them like gifts. Once, he braided together thin branches to create a crude basket, then filled it with the bright red berries he knew I liked. The gesture was so deliberately thoughtful that I had to turn away to hide the emotion on my face. I knew I was violating every protocol in wildlife biology. I knew I was risking my career, my reputation, possibly even my freedom if the wrong authorities discovered what I was doing. But Reed had become more than a research subject. He'd become someone I protected, someone I cared about in a way that transcended scientific interest. At night, lying in my apartment in Seattle, I'd think about him alone in the forest and feel an ache that was almost parental. It was a cold Friday in early March when everything began to shift. I arrived to find Reed waiting at our usual meeting spot, but his demeanor was different. Agitated, excited. He grabbed my hand, something he rarely did, and pulled me toward his shelter. The ground around it was covered in new drawings, more complex than anything he'd created before. My breath caught as I recognized what I was seeing. Astronomical symbols, star charts, mathematical equations scratched into flat rock with such precision they could have been computer rendered. Reed pointed to specific constellations I recognized, Orion, the Pleiades, then gestured upward to the sky. He made a swooping motion with his hand, like something descending. Then he pointed to himself. "Not from here," he said in his halting English, the words clear despite his accent. "Before here." I stared at the drawings, my scientific training warring with the impossible implications of what he was showing me. These weren't crude approximations. They were sophisticated representations of celestial mechanics, concepts that should have been far beyond the capability of any non-human terrestrial species. The equations scratched into the rock looked like orbital calculations, precise and deliberate. That's when I first felt it. Not wonder or excitement at discovering something remarkable. Fear. Cold, creeping fear that what I'd found wasn't just a new species of primate hiding in the wilderness. Reed was showing me something that challenged fundamental assumptions about biology, evolution, the very nature of life on Earth. I photographed everything with shaking hands, my mind already trying to rationalize, to find alternative explanations. But deep down, in the part of me that couldn't lie to itself, I knew. Reed wasn't just intelligent. He was something else entirely. And those drawings were the beginning of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Over the next 3 months, Reed's drawings became more and more complex. What started as simple star patterns grew into detailed charts that filled every flat surface around his shelter. He drew geometric shapes that interlocked in ways that hurt my eyes to follow. He scratched numbers into rocks, prime number sequences that any mathematician would recognize. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. He understood mathematical concepts that I'd learned in graduate school. I started bringing notebooks and pencils from the store, thinking maybe the crude charcoal and sticks were limiting him. Reed picked up a pencil the first time I offered it and immediately began writing. Not drawing anymore, writing. The symbols weren't English or any language I recognized, but they followed clear grammatical patterns. Subject, verb, object. Tenses that shifted based on time references. He was creating written language right in front of me, and doing it with the ease of someone remembering rather than inventing. My hand shook as I photographed page after page of Reed's writing. I had a PhD in behavioral ecology. I'd spent years studying animal cognition, from tool use in crows to self-recognition in dolphins. Nothing in my education prepared me for this. Reed wasn't just smart for an animal. He was operating at a level that exceeded most human children his apparent age. He understood abstract concepts, causality, symbolic representation. When I tried to teach him basic addition, he was already doing multiplication by the end of the session. The fear I'd felt in March grew into something darker. A creeping dread that followed me back to Seattle after each visit, that made me jump at shadows in my apartment. I stopped mentioning Reed, even in vague terms, to colleagues. I deleted backup photos from my cloud storage, keeping everything on encrypted external drives hidden in my closet. Something about Reed's intelligence felt dangerous to document, though I couldn't articulate why. In late April, Reed created something that made my blood run cold. Using hundreds of small rocks, he built a three-dimensional model on the forest floor. It took him most of the day, and I watched in silence as the structure took shape. When he finished, I recognized it immediately. The constellation Orion, but not as we see it from Earth. I took detailed photographs and measurements, then spent 3 sleepless nights comparing Reed's model to astronomical databases. Finally, I broke my own rule about keeping this secret and sent the images to an old friend from graduate school, Dr. James Park, who'd gone into astrophysics. I told him I was working on a creative art project, didn't mention Reed or Bigfoot or anything that would raise questions. I just asked if the perspective on the constellation looked familiar. James called me 2 days later, excitement clear in his voice. "Marcus, this is incredible. Where did you get this perspective?" I stayed quiet, letting him continue. This is Orion, viewed from approximately 640 light-years away, probably somewhere in the Betelgeuse region. The angles are nearly perfect. "Who's your artist?" I mumbled something about a computer simulation and ended the call quickly. Then I sat on my apartment floor, staring at my phone, trying to breathe through the panic. 640 light-years. Reed had created an accurate star chart from a vantage point that no human, no Earth-based observer should be able to replicate. Unless he'd seen it. Unless he remembered it. I tried to rationalize it for weeks. Maybe Reed had seen satellite images somehow, been exposed to astronomy books before I found him. Maybe it was coincidence, random arrangement of rocks that happened to look like something meaningful. But the excuses felt hollow even as I made them. Deep down, I knew what I was looking at. Evidence of knowledge that didn't come from Earth. The language breakthrough happened in June. Reed had been combining English words with his vocalizations for months, but one evening, everything clicked into place. He pointed to the sun and asked, "Where's Skyfire go?" I explained sunset, the Earth rotating, how the sun doesn't actually go anywhere. Reed listened carefully, then drew a circle in the dirt and showed how it spun, demonstrating understanding of planetary rotation after a single explanation. Over the following weeks, he asked constant questions. Why does water fall down? Gravity. Why do leaves change color? Chlorophyll breakdown, seasonal adaptation. Why do I breathe? Cellular respiration, oxygen exchange. He absorbed every answer and built on it, asking follow-up questions that showed he was constructing a complete mental model of how the world worked. His curiosity wasn't random. It was systematic, methodical, like someone filling gaps in memory rather than learning new information. One warm evening in early August, Reed drew 2 figures in his notebook. One was clearly meant to be me, tall with short hair and the jacket I always wore. The other was himself, shorter, covered in fur. He drew us standing on ground, then drew a curved line beneath us to show the Earth. Then he drew stars above us and pointed upward. He touched the drawing of himself, then pointed to the stars. He made a swooping gesture with his hand, something coming down from above. Then he looked at me with those dark, intelligent eyes and spoke slowly, making sure I understood every word. "Not from here," he said, "before here. Long, long before time. Skyboat." My mouth went dry. Skyboat, a vessel, a craft. Reed was telling me he came from somewhere else, that his kind came from the stars. I wanted to dismiss it as misunderstanding, as Reed repeating something he'd seen in a movie or overheard from hikers. But there were no movies out here, no hikers in this remote section. There was only Reed and the knowledge he carried, knowledge that had no earthly explanation. "Show me," I whispered. "Show me more." Reed flipped to a new page and began drawing rapidly. He sketched what looked like a craft, cylindrical with geometric patterns on the sides. He drew it whole, then drew it broken, pieces scattered. He drew many figures like himself, maybe 50 or 60, gathered around the wreckage. Then he drew human figures, primitive ones with spears and clubs. He drew them attacking, his people running, hiding. The drawings told a story, an arrival, an accident, a crash. Survivors stranded on an alien world. First contact with humans that went terribly wrong. His people learning to hide, to stay away from the violent species that already claimed this planet. Generations passing, populations dwindling, slowly adapting to forests and mountains while trying to remain invisible. Reed drew more. He showed how his kind grew fewer and fewer over time, small groups scattered across vast distances. He drew children being born, growing up, some of them starting to remember more than their parents. Like waking up from a long sleep, he tried to explain. Young ones remember better. Old knowledge coming back. I asked the question I was terrified to hear answered. "What happened to your family?" Reed's hand paused over the notebook. Then he drew new figures, humans in different clothes. Not primitive warriors, but modern people in uniforms. He drew vehicles, helicopters, boxes that looked like cages. He drew his family being taken, loaded into trucks, driven away. He drew himself hiding, watching, too small to stop it. His family hadn't died from disease or animal attacks. They'd been captured, taken by people who knew exactly what they were hunting. "Where?" I asked, my voice barely working. "Where did they take them?" Reed shook his head. He didn't know, but the fear in his eyes was clear. The same people could come back, could find him, could take him away to wherever his family disappeared. I promised him, right then, that I'd keep him safe, that I'd protect him no matter what. But even as I made that promise, I felt the weight of how powerless I really was. Because if there were people out there who knew about Reed's kind, who were hunting and capturing them, then I was already in over my head. I started noticing things on my next few visits. Boot prints in mud that didn't match my treads, too fresh to be from casual hikers. Disturbed ground near the trails leading to Reed's area, like someone had walked through recently and tried to cover their tracks. Once, I found a granola bar wrapper that definitely wasn't mine. The expiration date showing it was only a few weeks old. Someone else had been in this area. Someone else knew something was here. The cave discovery happened on a humid Friday in late August. Reed seemed anxious all morning, pacing, making soft, distressed sounds. Finally, he grabbed my hand and pulled me deeper into the forest than we'd ever gone together. We hiked for almost an hour, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through thick undergrowth until we reached an area I'd never seen before. A limestone cliff face rose up from the forest floor, covered in moss and ferns. Reed led me to a narrow opening, barely visible behind a curtain of vegetation. Inside was a cave, maybe 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The floor was covered in old leaves and dirt, but underneath, partially buried, were objects that made my heart stop. Metallic fragments, dull gray, but not corroded despite obvious age. Synthetic materials that had no business being in a cave in the North Cascades. I knelt and carefully brushed dirt away from the largest piece, revealing geometric etchings on the surface. The same symbols Reed had been drawing for months. These weren't natural formations. They weren't human-made either. The metal was too light, the alloys too strange. The pieces showed signs of extreme heat damage, melted edges rehardened in ways that suggested catastrophic failure. A crash. An actual crash. Reed pointed to the fragments, then to himself, then up toward the sky. "Skyboat broke in," he said, long before time. I finally understood why Reed's family was gone, and it wasn't hunters or disease that took them. They'd been taken by people who somehow knew the truth, who'd perhaps known for decades. People who collected evidence, who captured Bigfoot for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. The artifacts in this cave weren't just proof that Reed's story was real. They were proof that someone, somewhere, had known about this all along. And if they knew about the crash site, they knew about Reed. They'd always known. They were just waiting for the right moment to take him too. I spent hours in that cave, carefully examining every fragment while Reed watched from the entrance. The metallic pieces varied in size from shards no bigger than my thumbnail to sections nearly 2 feet long. I pulled a digital scale from my pack and weighed the largest piece. 3.7 pounds, but it felt lighter than it should, as if the material itself defied normal physics. The surface had a strange quality, not quite reflective but not entirely matte either, like it absorbed and released light at slightly different rates than ordinary metal. The geometric symbols etched into several fragments matched Reed's drawings exactly. I traced my fingers over them, feeling the precision of the grooves, the mathematical perfection of angles that couldn't have been carved by hand. These weren't decorative. They served some purpose, perhaps labeling or instructional marking. I photographed everything from multiple angles, using a ruler for scale, documenting the location of each piece within the cave. Reed became increasingly agitated as I worked, pacing near the entrance and making low, anxious vocalizations. When I tried to examine a particularly well-preserved section that showed what might have been circuitry or conduit channels, Reed physically pulled me away. His massive hands, gentle but insistent, guided me back from the artifacts. He pointed to them, then made a braking gesture, then clutched his own chest as if in pain. The objects hurt him somehow, or the memories they carried did. I carefully collected 3 small fragments, pieces no larger than coins, wrapping them in cloth and sealing them in waterproof bags. I told myself it was for analysis, for verification, but really I was gathering evidence in case something happened to me or to Reed. Proof that this wasn't delusion or fantasy. The fragments went into my personal safe the moment I returned home, hidden behind tax documents and old passports where no casual search would find them. Over the next 2 months, Reed told me his people's story in pieces, through drawings and broken English and pantomime that filled in gaps his limited vocabulary couldn't cover. The narrative emerged slowly, like a puzzle assembling itself one fragment at a time. His kind had come from the stars thousands of years ago. Not invaders or colonizers, but travelers who'd suffered catastrophic failure. Reed drew their vessel, larger than the fragment suggested, something that must have broken apart on entry. He showed me 50, maybe 60 figures emerging from the wreckage. The survivors had been stranded with no way home, no rescue coming, no technology intact enough to repair what had been destroyed. The first encounters with humans had been disastrous. Reed drew primitive settlements, early peoples who met his ancestors with fear and violence, spears, clubs, fire. His people learned quickly that this planet's dominant species saw them as threats, as monsters, as something to be destroyed. So they hid, they moved into deep forests, into mountains, into places humans rarely ventured. They became nocturnal, silent, invisible. Centuries passed in Reed's drawings. His people adapted to Earth's environment, learned to survive in wilderness, developed primitive tools from what the forest provided, but they never forgot what they'd been. The knowledge remained, passed down through generations, encoded somehow in their biology or culture. Reed couldn't explain exactly how, but he knew things he'd never been taught. Mathematical principles, astronomical facts, technological concepts that surfaced in his mind like memories from someone else's life. The population dwindled over time. Reed showed me through progressively smaller groups in his drawings, isolated families scattered across vast distances, rarely making contact with each other. The reproduction rate was low, perhaps because they were never meant to live in Earth's environment. Disease took some, accidents took others, and occasionally humans found them. Those encounters rarely ended well for his kind. Then Reed drew something that made my stomach drop. Modern humans in military-style uniforms, equipped with advanced gear. Helicopters, trucks, weapons that weren't meant to kill, but to capture. Nets, tranquilizer darts, cages. He showed these figures taking his people, documenting them, loading them into vehicles. Not just his immediate family, but others over the years, different groups taken from different locations. Reed had witnessed his own family's capture when he was very young, maybe equivalent to a human 6-year-old. He'd been small enough to hide in a hollow log while men in uniforms rounded up his parents, his siblings, everyone he knew. He'd watched them being sedated, tagged, photographed, then driven away in unmarked trucks. He'd waited 3 days in that log, terrified and alone, before finally emerging to find the camp completely cleared, every trace of his family's presence erased. The people who took them weren't random hunters or local authorities. They'd come with specific equipment, specific protocols, like they'd done this before, like they had systems in place for capturing and containing Bigfoot. Reed drew laboratory settings, metal rooms, beings like himself behind barriers. He couldn't have seen these places himself, but somehow he knew. Perhaps from stories passed down, perhaps from some form of communication his species used that I didn't understand. I asked him why they wanted his kind. Reed struggled to explain, pointing to his arms to show his strength, to his head to indicate intelligence, to his chest to show his heart still beating despite the harsh conditions he'd survived. They wanted to study Bigfoot biology, to understand how his people had adapted, to learn secrets his species carried. Genetic material from beings not evolved on Earth would be invaluable to the right researchers, to governments or corporations willing to ignore ethics for advancement. The implications crashed over me like cold water. If Reed's people were extraterrestrial refugees, then their DNA, their cellular structure, their neurological patterns, everything about them represented alien biology. The scientific and military applications would be staggering. Strength enhancements, sensory improvements, cognitive augmentation, longevity research. Reed said some of his kind lived for 300 years or more. Imagine what pharmaceutical companies would pay for that knowledge. And if there were organizations that had known about Bigfoot origins since at least the 1960s, maybe earlier, then there had been decades of covert research. Decades of captures, studies, cover-ups. The entire Bigfoot mythology, the blurry photographs and questionable footprints and conspiracy theories. It all served a purpose. Keep the subject ridiculous enough that serious scientists wouldn't investigate. Keep sightings in the realm of tabloids and cable shows, and meanwhile, systematically collect the real creatures for classified programs nobody would believe existed. Reed drew more, showing me that his generation was different from his parents' generation. The young ones, those reaching maturity in recent decades, were experiencing something his people called the awakening. memories surfacing stronger, cognitive abilities increasing, technological intuition returning. It was like their biology knew it had been dormant too long and was trying to reassert what they'd once been. Reed was part of that awakening generation, which explained his rapid learning, his advanced intelligence, his ability to grasp complex concepts so quickly. But the awakening also made them more visible, more likely to do things that attracted attention, like building sophisticated structures or creating symbols that didn't match primitive wilderness dwellers. The very thing that made Reed's generation special also endangered them further. I realized why he'd been alone when I found him. He hadn't just escaped after his family's capture. He'd been deliberately separated, maybe abandoned by his own people because his awakening made him too risky to keep close. Or perhaps his family had hidden him, sacrificed themselves to ensure at least one of their bloodlines survived. Either way, Reed had been living in isolation not for months, but for years, maybe most of his life. The weight of what I'd learned pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. We weren't dealing with an undiscovered primate species or a missing link in human evolution. We were dealing with refugees from a cosmic accident, survivors of an interstellar tragedy who'd been systematically hunted by our species for millennia. And now, in their final generations, when their true nature was finally surfacing, we were harvesting them like resources. I looked at Reed, this child who'd shown me wonders and horrors in equal measure, who'd trusted me with secrets that could get us both killed, and I understood the full scope of my responsibility. I wasn't just protecting an endangered animal. I was protecting one of the last survivors of an alien civilization, a being whose very existence challenged every assumption humanity made about its place in the universe. And somewhere out there, the people who'd taken his family were still operating, still collecting specimens, still maintaining the greatest cover-up in human history. They had resources, authority, technology, decades of experience hunting and capturing Reed's kind. All I had was a PhD in biology and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something far beyond my ability to handle. But I'd made a promise to keep Reed safe, and I intended to keep it, no matter what it cost me. The question wasn't whether they'd come for him eventually. The question was how much time we had before they did. The surveillance equipment appeared in early November. I found the first camera on a Tuesday morning, mounted 15 feet up in a Douglas fir about 100 yards from Reed's shelter. It was small, professional grade, the kind used by wildlife researchers or law enforcement. The lens was pointed directly at the trail I used to reach Reed's area. I left it in place, not wanting to alert whoever placed it that I'd noticed, but my hands shook as I continued hiking. Over the next week, I found 3 more cameras and 2 audio recording devices disguised as rocks. The placement was strategic, covering every approach to Reed's territory. Whoever installed them knew exactly what they were doing and had been watching long enough to map my movement patterns. I started varying my routes, bushwhacking through dense undergrowth to avoid the obvious trails, but I knew it was only delaying the inevitable. The boot prints confirmed my worst fears. Fresh tracks in soft mud near the creek, military-style treads that bit deep into the earth. Size 11 or 12, 2 different sets, walking together in a search pattern. The prints were less than 12 hours old when I found them, still holding crisp edges before the morning dew had softened them. These weren't lost hikers. They were professionals conducting reconnaissance. I tried to stay calm around Reed, but he sensed my anxiety immediately. Bigfoot have incredible observational skills, reading body language and emotional states with accuracy that borders on supernatural. Reed touched my shoulder and made a questioning sound, his dark eyes searching my face. I showed him the photographs I'd taken of the cameras and boot prints. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He made a sound I'd never heard before, high-pitched and desperate, and began gathering his few possessions with frantic movements. He drew quickly in his notebook, the same images from before. Uniformed figures, trucks, cages, his family being taken. Then he pointed to himself and drew bars, a cell, isolation. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. The fear radiating from him was so intense I could almost feel it physically, like heat from a fire. The confrontation happened 3 days later. I'd arrived at dawn, hoping the early hour would give us privacy, but 2 men in tactical gear emerged from the tree line as I approached Reed's shelter. They moved with military precision, flanking positions designed to cut off retreat routes. Both carried sidearms on their hips and radios clipped to their vests. The taller one spoke first, his voice calm and professional. "Dr. Webb, we need to talk." I stopped walking, every muscle in my body tensing. They knew my name. They knew my credentials. How long had they been watching? "I'm just doing wolf research," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This is protected federal land. You need permits to operate here." The second man, shorter but broader, smiled without warmth. "We have permits, Dr. Webb. Department of Interior, Special Research Division. You can verify our credentials if you'd like, though we both know you won't." He was right. Getting authorities involved would expose Reed, and these men knew it. They had me trapped by my own need for secrecy. The tall one pulled out a tablet and turned it to face me. The screen showed photographs, dozens of them. Me hiking to Reed's location, me carrying supplies, me sitting beside Reed's shelter. Thermal imaging showed 2 heat signatures, one human-sized, one larger. They had everything documented, every visit, every interaction over the past months. "You've made contact with the specimen we've been tracking for 2 years," he said. "We've been patient, Dr. Webb, allowing you your research. But it's time to bring the subject in. We need you to facilitate transfer." "Transfer?" My voice cracked. "You mean capture? You mean putting him in a cage?" The shorter man stepped closer, his expression hardening. "We mean containing a non-terrestrial biological entity that poses potential risks to national security. We've been recovering specimens like this for decades. Your subject will be well cared for, studied humanely, and—" "Like you cared for his family?" I interrupted. "Like you studied them humanely while they were ripped away from everything they knew?" Silence stretched between us. The tall man's jaw tightened slightly, the only crack in his professional demeanor. "You have 48 hours to bring the juvenile to the coordinates we'll provide," he said finally. "Cooperate, and you'll be brought into the program as a consultant. Your career will be protected, enhanced even. Refuse, and you'll face federal charges for interfering with classified operations and withholding evidence of extraterrestrial contact. Your choice, Dr. Webb." They left without waiting for my answer, disappearing into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. I stood frozen for several minutes, my mind racing through impossible options. Every path forward led to disaster. Comply, and Reed would spend the rest of his life in captivity, studied like a lab animal. Refuse, and I'd be arrested while they took him anyway, only now without anyone to advocate for his treatment. I found Reed hidden in thick brush a quarter-mile away. He'd heard everything. His eyes held a resignation that broke my heart, the look of someone who'd always known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't stop these people permanently, couldn't fight a covert government program with unlimited resources and decades of experience. But I could give Reed a chance. One opportunity to disappear so completely that even they couldn't find him. It was a desperate plan, probably doomed to fail, but doing nothing guaranteed his capture. I spent the next day gathering everything Reed would need for long-term survival in deep wilderness. High-calorie food, water purification tablets, a compass, detailed topographic maps of the North Cascades extending into British Columbia. Medical supplies, some fire-starting equipment, a hunting knife, warm clothing sized for his frame. I withdrew $5,000 in cash, though I had no idea if Reed understood currency or could use it if he reached areas where humans might help him. The hardest part was planning a route. Reed needed to reach true wilderness, areas so remote that even satellites would struggle to track individual movement. The North Cascades extended deep into Canada, vast stretches of mountains and old-growth forest that humans rarely penetrated. If Reed could make it across the border and into the coast mountains, he might find other survivors of his kind, or at least isolation deep enough to wait out the search. We left on the second night, just hours before my deadline expired. I led Reed through the darkest hours, using night vision equipment I'd borrowed from the department under false pretenses. We moved in a winding pattern designed to confuse tracking, crossing streams frequently to break scent trails, avoiding any established paths. Every sound made my heart hammer, every snap of a branch threatening discovery. After 6 hours of hiking, we reached a valley I'd identified as the last point I could safely guide him. Beyond lay true backcountry, terrain I didn't know well enough to navigate in darkness. Reed would have to continue alone. We stood together in the pre-dawn gray, the forest around us just beginning to wake with bird calls and rustling leaves. I showed Reed the maps one final time, tracing the route north with my finger, pointing out water sources and shelter locations I'd marked. He studied them carefully, his expression focused and serious. Then he looked at me, and I saw intelligence and gratitude and sorrow all mixed together in those dark eyes. Reed reached out one massive hand and touched my face gently, his palm warm against my cheek. "Thank friend," he said, the words clear despite his limited English. "Remember Marcus, always remember." He was telling me he'd remember me, that our time together had mattered to him as much as it had to me. Tears burned in my eyes as I gripped his hand. "Stay hidden," I whispered. "Stay safe. Find your people if you can." Reed nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the forest. I watched until even his dark shape was swallowed by shadows and distance, until there was nothing left but silence and the knowledge that I'd likely never see him again. I hiked back alone, arriving at my truck just as full dawn broke. The men were waiting, their expressions cold and furious. I told them Reed had fled, that something had spooked him days ago and he'd vanished before I could facilitate any transfer. They didn't believe me, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Not yet. That afternoon, federal agents arrived at my apartment with a warrant. They seized my computers, my external drives, my field notes, every piece of equipment I owned. They questioned me for 6 hours, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to break my story. I stuck to the script I'd prepared. Reed was gone. I didn't know where. I'd been trying to study him, not hide him. The charges they'd threatened never materialized, but my career died anyway. I was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. My security clearance was revoked. Colleagues started avoiding my calls. Within a month, it was clear I'd never work in wildlife biology again. The Whisper campaign painted me as unstable, obsessed, someone who'd fabricated data and wasted department resources chasing cryptids. My wife left 3 months later. I couldn't explain what I'd been doing, couldn't defend myself without exposing Reed, and the stress destroyed what was left of our marriage. By spring, I was living alone, unemployed, professionally ruined, and under constant surveillance. But Reed was free, and that had to be enough. The official investigation lasted 8 months. They never filed criminal charges, but they didn't need to. My reputation was destroyed through careful leaks to academic circles, whispered suggestions that I'd falsified wolf research data, that I'd suffered a mental breakdown in the field. The University of Washington quietly declined to renew my research affiliation. The Department of Fish and Wildlife accepted my resignation with obvious relief. I was 32 years old, and my career was over. My forced retirement became official in March 2011, though I'd stopped receiving paychecks 6 months earlier. The severance package was generous, almost suspiciously so, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement with language so broad it essentially prevented me from discussing anything related to my work. I signed it because refusing would have triggered more scrutiny, more questions I couldn't answer without endangering Reed. The divorce finalized that same spring. Jennifer took the house, most of our savings, and the life we'd built together. She deserved better than a husband who couldn't explain where he'd been or what he'd done, who jumped at unexpected sounds and checked his rearview mirror constantly for surveillance vehicles. The paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. I'd catch glimpses of the same dark sedan parked on my street. Different drivers, but same government plates. My phone made clicking sounds during calls. Mail arrived, opened, and clumsily resealed. I started digging into the organization that had tried to take Reed, using the fragments of information I'd gathered and the access I still had to academic databases before my credentials were revoked. The research consumed my days, filling the empty hours with purpose even as it revealed truths that made sleep impossible. Through Freedom of Information Act requests that took years to process, I found heavily redacted documents mentioning non-terrestrial biological entities in the context of Pacific Northwest operations. The dates went back to 1947, the same year as the Roswell incident everyone knew about. But while Roswell got media attention, something else had crashed in the Washington state that year. Something the government worked much harder to keep quiet. I connected with 3 other researchers through encrypted forums and dark web channels, people who'd had similar experiences with government interference in cryptozoology studies. Dr. Sarah Chen, ironically, was one of them. My former supervisor had known more than she'd ever let on, had been documenting Bigfoot encounters for 15 years before I joined the department. She'd been forced out 3 years after me, her research confiscated, her warnings about systematic collection of specimens ignored until they became inconvenient truths. Together, we pieced together a horrifying picture. A program that had operated since at least the 1960s, possibly longer, specifically targeting Bigfoot for capture and study. The goal wasn't just scientific curiosity. Military contractors wanted to understand their strength, their sensory capabilities, their remarkable healing abilities. Pharmaceutical companies wanted their longevity secrets, their resistance to diseases that killed humans. Genetic research programs wanted to unlock the code of beings whose DNA wasn't Earth-evolved. The estimated population of Bigfoot in North America had crashed from perhaps 2,000 in 1950 to maybe 200 to 400 by 2010. They were being systematically eliminated, not through violence but through strategic collection. take breeding-age adults, disrupt family groups, fragment populations until genetic diversity collapsed. In another generation, maybe two, they'd be functionally extinct. I thought about Reed constantly during those years, wondered if he'd made it to safety, if he'd found others of his kind, if he was even still alive. The not knowing was its own form of torture, but it was better than the alternative. Better to wonder than to learn he'd been captured, that my sacrifice had been for nothing. Then, in 2013, I received the first sign. I'd been hiking in a remote section of the North Cascades near the Canadian border, leaving food caches in case Reed or others might find them. It was a ritual more than a practical action, a way of maintaining connection to something I'd lost. I'd placed a bag of apples and dried salmon on a flat rock, marked it with a small cairn of stones, and left. When I returned 2 weeks later, the food was gone. That wasn't unusual. Bears and other scavengers would take easy meals. But beside the cairn, someone had arranged stones in a pattern I recognized immediately. The same geometric symbol Reed had drawn dozens of times, the marking that represented his people. And next to it, pressed into soft dirt, was a handprint, large, 5-fingered, with proportions that weren't quite human. My hands shook as I photographed it, took measurements. Length 17 inches, width 9 inches across the palm. Too large for Reed, who'd been juvenile when I'd last seen him. But the symbol was his, the placement too deliberate to be coincidence. Someone from his world had been here, had seen my offering, had left acknowledgement. Over the next 5 years, I found similar signs. Never in the same location twice, always months apart, spread across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Sometimes symbols carved into tree bark, sometimes rock arrangements. Once a bundle of wildflowers of a type Reed had particularly loved, left on my truck hood in a remote trailhead parking lot. Someone was tracking my movements, letting me know they were alive. They remembered. They were okay. In 2016, a backcountry ranger I knew mentioned an unusual sighting in his report. A group of Bigfoot, at least 4 individuals, including what appeared to be juveniles, spotted at dawn near a high mountain lake. They'd moved with purpose and coordination, showed no signs of distress, and disappeared into dense forest before he could photograph them. The location was in British Columbia, deep in the coast mountains where I'd hoped Reed might find refuge. I wanted to believe one of those figures had been Reed, now fully grown, perhaps with a family of his own. The timeline worked. He'd have been approaching full maturity, old enough to reproduce if he'd found others. The thought that he might have survived, might have found community and purpose, made the cost of everything I'd lost feel bearable. The package arrived in 2019, 9 years after I'd last seen Reed. No return address, postmarked from Vancouver, British Columbia. Inside was a waterproof bag containing my old field journals, the ones seized during the investigation. Most pages had been removed, presumably destroyed, but someone had returned what remained. A note was paperclipped to the front cover, handwritten in block letters. Project discontinued 2019. Specimens relocated. They know you helped the juvenile. They're watching to see if it contacts you. If it does, we'll know. A friend. The message was clear. The covert research program had ended or transformed into something else, but the surveillance hadn't. I was still being monitored, still being used as potential bait to lure Reed or others back into contact. Any reunion would trigger immediate response. My apartment was probably wired. My movements were certainly tracked. Even after a decade, they hadn't forgotten or forgiven my interference. I understood then that I would never see Reed again, not safely. Any attempt to find him would lead them right to him. The greatest gift I could give was absence, the certainty that I wouldn't become the pathway to his capture. It was a bitter realization, knowing that protecting him meant maintaining distance forever. I'm 62 now, still living in Washington, still hiking the same forests where everything changed. I leave food at remote locations, marking them with small cairns that could be natural or could be intentional. Sometimes the food is taken. Sometimes I find signs that might mean something or might be coincidence. I choose to believe they mean something. What I learned about Bigfoot changed everything I thought I knew about life, about intelligence, about our place in the cosmos. They aren't monsters or missing links. They're refugees from a cosmic accident, survivors who've endured millennia of fear and hiding while slowly disappearing from a world that was never meant to be their home. We met beings from the stars, and instead of wonder or compassion, we chose extraction and exploitation. We repeated the same pattern of violence our species has shown toward every form of intelligence we've encountered. Reed taught me that intelligence and tool use don't determine worth. Compassion does. Empathy does. The choice to protect someone even when it costs you everything you've built. I lost my career, my marriage, my reputation, every achievement I'd worked toward. But I'd make the same choice again without hesitation, because some things matter more than professional success or social standing. Last month, I found a new carving near one of my food caches. A mathematical proof, the same one I'd taught Reed during our time together, but extended and solved in ways I hadn't shown him. The solution was elegant, sophisticated, showing years of continued learning and growth. Whoever carved it had taken what I'd taught and built upon it, had continued evolving intellectually despite living in wilderness and hiding. Reed is alive, or at least someone who learned from Reed is alive, carrying forward the knowledge I'd shared. They're still out there in the deep places where humans rarely go, still hidden, still hoping that maybe someday our species will evolve enough to deserve meeting them properly. Not as specimens to be captured or resources to be exploited, but as fellow travelers in a universe stranger and more wonderful than we've allowed ourselves to imagine. I'll keep leaving food in the wilderness, keep watching for signs, keep protecting their secret for whatever years I have remaining. Because they're still here, still surviving against impossible odds. And as long as one person remembers what they really are, knows their true story, and chooses silence over revelation, they have a chance. A small chance, but more than they'd have if the world knew the truth. Some secrets aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be honored. And this is one secret I'll take to my grave.